The history of astronomy. Wonder, surprise, and admiration are words which, though often confounded, denote, in our language, sentiments that are indeed alike, but that are in some respects different also, and distinct from one another. What is new and singular excites that sentiment which, in strict propriety, is called wonder. What is unexpected? Surprise. And what is great or beautiful? Admiration. Je peux plus écouter, je suis en direct, je dis Adam Smith. We wonder at all extraordinary and uncommon objects, at all the rare phenomena of nature, and at meteors, comets, eclipses, at singular plants and animals, and at everything, in short, with which we have before been either little or not at all acquainted, and we still wonder, though forewarned of what we are to see. We are surprised at those things which we have seen often, but which we least of all expected to meet with in the place where we find them. We are surprised at the sudden appearance of a friend, whom we have seen 1,000 times, but whom we did not imagine we were to see them then. We admire the beauty of a plain or the greatness of a mountain, though we have seen both often before, and though nothing appears to us in either, but what we had expected with certainty to see. Whether this criticism upon the precise meaning of these words be just is of little importance. I imagine it is just, though I acknowledge that the best writers in our language have not always made use of them according to it. Milton, upon the appearance of death to Satan, says that the find what this might be admired, not feared. Paradise Lost, but Milton wrote the undoubted find. But if this criticism be just, the proper expression should have been wondered. Dryden, upon the discovery of Iphigenia sleeping, says that the fool of nature stood with stupid eyes and gaping mouth that testified surprise. But what Simon must have felt upon this occasion could not so much be surprise as wonder and admiration. All that I contend for is, that the sentiments excited by what is new, by what is unexpected, and by what is great and beautiful, are really different, however the words however the words made use of to express them may sometimes be confounded. Even the admiration which is excited by beauty is quite different, as will appear more fully hereafter, from that which is inspired by greatness, though we have but one word to denote them. These sentiments, like all others when inspired by one and the same object, mutually support and enliven one another. Enliven. An object with which we are quite familiar, and which we see every day, produces, though both great and beautiful, but a small effect upon us, because our admiration is not supported either by wonder or by surprise. And if we have heard a very accurate description of a monster, our wonder will be the less when we see it, because our previous knowledge of it will in a great measure prevent our surprise. It is the design of this essay to consider particularly the nature and causes of each of these sentiments, whose influence is of far wider extent than we should be apt upon a careless view to imagine. I shall begin with surprise. Section 1 of the effect of unexpectedness or of surprise. When an object of any kind, which has been for some time expected and foreseen, presents itself, whatever be the emotion which it is by nature fitted to excite, the mind must have been prepared for it, and must even in some measure have convinced it beforehand, because the idea of the object having been so long present to it, must have beforehand excited some degree of the same emotion which the object itself would excite. The change, therefore, which its presence produces comes thus to be less considerable, and the emotion or passion which it excites glides gradually and easily into the heart, without violence, pain, or difficulty. Hume, Treatise of Human Nature, of the Connection or Association of Ideas. But the contrary of all this happens when the object is unexpected. The passion is then poured in all at once upon the heart, which is thrown, if it is a strong passion, into the most violent and convulsive emotions, such as sometimes cause immediate death, sometimes by the suddenness of the ecstasy, so entirely disjoint the whole frame of the imagination, that it never after returns to its former tone and composure, but falls either into a frenzy or habitual lunacy, and such as almost always occasion a momentary loss of reason, or of that attention to other things which our situation or our duty requires. How much we dread the effects of the more violent passions, when they come suddenly upon the mind, appears from those preparations which all men think necessary when going to inform any one of what is capable of exciting them. Who would choose all at once to inform his friend of an extraordinary calamity that had befallen him, without taking care beforehand, by alarming him with an uncertain fear, to announce, if one may say so, his misfortune, and thereby prepare and dispose him for receiving the tidings? Those panic terrors which sometimes seize armies in the fields or great cities when an enemy is in the neighborhood, and which deprive for a time the most determined of all deliberate judgments, are never excited but by the sudden apprehension of unexpected danger. Such violent consternations, which at once confound whole multitudes, benumb their understandings, and agitate their hearts with all the agony of extravagant fear, can never be produced by any foreseen danger, how great soever. Fear, though naturally a very strong passion, never rises to such excesses, unless exasperated both by wonder, from the uncertain nature of the danger, and by surprise, from the suddenness of the apprehension. Surprise, therefore, is not to be regarded as an original emotion of a species distinct from all others. The violent and sudden change produced upon the mind, when an emotion of any kind is brought suddenly upon it, constitutes the whole nature of surprise. But when not only a passion and a great passion comes all at once upon the mind, but when it comes upon it while the mind is in the mood most unfit for conceiving it, the surprise is then the greatest. Surprises of joy when the mind is sunk into grief, or of grief when it is elated with joy, are therefore the most insupportable. The change is in this case the greatest possible. Not only a strong passion is conceived all at once, but a strong passion the direct opposite of that which was before in possession of the soul. When a load of sorrow comes down upon the heart that is expanded and elated with gaiety and joy, it seems not only to damp and oppress it, but almost to crush and bruise it, as a real weight would crush and bruise the body. On the contrary, when from an unexpected change of fortune, a tide of gladness seems, if I may say so, to spring up all at once within it. When depressed and contracted with grief and sorrow, it feels as if suddenly extended and heaved up with violent and irresistible force, and is torn with pangs of all others most exquisite, and which almost always occasion faintings, deliriums, and sometimes instant death. For it may be worth while to observe that though grief be a more violent passion than joy, as indeed all uneasy sensations seem naturally more pungent than the opposite agreeable ones, yet of the two, surprises of joy are still more insupportable than surprises of grief. We are told that after the battle of Trasimenus, while a Roman lady, who had been informed that her son was slain in the action, was sitting alone bemoaning her misfortunes, the young man who escaped came suddenly into the room to her, and that she cried out and expired instantly in a transport of joy. Let us suppose the contrary of this to have happened, and that in the midst of domestic festivity and mirth he had suddenly fallen down dead at her feet. It is likely that the effects would have been equally violent. I imagine not. The heart springs to joy with a sort of natural elasticity; it abandons itself to so agreeable an emotion as soon as the object is presented. It seems to pant and leap forward to meet it, and the passion in its full force takes at once entire and complete possession of the soul. But it is otherwise with grief. The heart recoils from and resists the first approaches of that disagreeable passion, and it requires some time before the melancholy object can produce its full effect. Grief comes on slowly and gradually, nor ever rises at once to that height of agony to which it is increased after a little time. But joy comes rushing upon us all at once like a torrent. The change produced therefore by a surprise of joy is more sudden, and upon that account more violent and apt to have more fatal effects, than that which is occasioned by a surprise of grief. There seems too to be something in the nature of surprise, which makes it unite more easily with the brisk and quick motion of joy than with the slower and heavier movement of grief, because we know people are going to die already. Most men who can take the trouble to recollect will find that they have heard of more people who died or became distracted with sudden joy than with sudden grief. Yet from the nature of human affairs, the latter must be much more frequent than the former. A man may break his leg or lose his son, though he has had no warning of either of these events, but he can hardly meet with an extraordinary piece of good fortune without having had some foresight of what was to happen. Not only grief and joy, but all the other passions are more violent when opposite extremes succeed each other. In any resentment so keen as what follows the quarrels of lovers, or any love so passionate as what attends their reconcilement. Even the objects of the external senses affect us in a more lively manner when opposite extremes succeed to, or are placed beside each other. Moderate warmth seems intolerable heat if felt after extreme cold. What is bitter will seem more so when tasted after what is very sweet. A dirty white will seem bright and pure when placed by a jet black. The vivacity, in short, of every sensation, as well as of every sentiment, seems to be greater or less in proportion to the change made by the impression of either upon the situation of the mind or organ. But this change must necessarily be the greatest when opposite sentiments and sensations are contrasted, or succeed immediately to one another. Both sentiments and sensations are then the liveliest. And this superior vivacity proceeds from nothing but their being brought upon the mind or organ when in a state most unfit for conceiving them. As the opposition of contrasted sentiments heightens their vivacity, so the resemblance of those which immediately succeed each other renders them more faint and languid. A parent who has lost several children immediately after one another will be less affected with the death of the last than with that of the first, though the loss in itself be in this case undoubtedly greater. But his mind being already sunk into sorrow, the new misfortune seems to produce no other effect than a continuance of the same melancholy, and is by no means apt to occasion such transports of grief as are ordinarily excited by the first calamity of the kind. He receives it, though with great dejection, yet with some degree of calmness and composure, and without anything of that anguish and agitation of mind which the novelty of the misfortune is apt to occasion. Those who have been unfortunate through the whole course of their lives are often indeed habitually melancholy, and sometimes peevish and splenetic, yet upon any fresh disappointment, though they are vexed and complain a little, they seldom fly out into any more violent passion, and never fall into those transports of rage or grief which often, upon the like occasions, distract the fortunate and successful. Upon these are founded, in a great measure, some of the effects of habit and custom. It is well known that custom deadens the vivacity of both pain and pleasure, abates the grief we should feel for the one, and weakens the joy we should derive from the other. The pain is supported without agony, and the pleasure enjoyed without rapture, because custom and the frequent repetition of any object comes at last to form and bend the mind or organ to that habitual mood and disposition which fits them to receive its impression, without undergoing any very violent change. Section 2. Of wonder, or of the effects of novelty. It is evident that the mind takes pleasure in observing the resemblances that are discoverable betwixt different objects. It is by means of such observations that it endeavours to arrange and methodize all its ideas, and to reduce them into proper classes and assortments. When it can observe but one single quality that is common to a great variety of otherwise widely different objects, that single circumstance will be sufficient for it to connect them all together, to reduce them to one common class, and to call them by one general name. It is thus that all things endowed with the power of self-motion, beasts, birds, fishes, insects, are classed under the general name of animal, and that these again, along with those which won that power, are arranged under the still more general word substance, and this is the origin of those assortments of objects and ideas which in the schools are called genera and species, and of those abstract and general names which in all languages are made use of to express them. The further we advance in knowledge and experience, the greater number of divisions and subdivisions of those genera and species we are both inclined and obliged to make. We observe a greater variety of particularities amongst those things which have a gross resemblance, and having made new divisions of them, according to those newly observed particularities, we are no longer to be satisfied with being able to refer an object to a remote genus or very general class of things, to many of which it has but a loose and imperfect resemblance. A person, indeed, unacquainted with botany may expect to satisfy your curiosity by telling you that such a vegetable is a weed, or perhaps in still more general terms, that it is a plant, but a botanist will neither give nor accept of such an answer. He has divided that great class of objects into a number of inferior assortments, according to those varieties which his experience has discovered among them, and he wants to refer each individual plant to some tribe of vegetables, with all of which it may have a more exact resemblance than with many things comprehended under the extensive genus of plants. A child imagines that it gives a satisfactory answer when it tells you that an object whose name it knows not is a thing, and fancies that it informs you of something when it thus ascertains to which of the two most obvious and comprehensive classes of objects a particular impression ought to be referred: to the class of realities or solid substances which it calls things, or to that of appearances which it calls nothings. Whatever, in short, occurs to us we are fond of referring to some species or class of things, with all of which it has a nearly exact resemblance, and though we often know no more about them than about it, yet we are apt to fancy that by being able to do so, we show ourselves to be better acquainted with it, and to have a more thorough insight into its nature. But when something quite new and singular is presented, we feel ourselves incapable of doing this. The memory cannot, from all its stores, cast up any image that nearly resembles this strange appearance. If by some of its qualities it seems to resemble and to be connected with a species which we have before been acquainted with, it is by others separated and detached from that, and from all the other assortments of things we have hitherto been able to make. It stands alone and by itself in the imagination, and refuses to be grouped or confounded with any set of objects whatever. The imagination and memory exert themselves to no purpose, and in vain look around all their classes of ideas in order to find one under which it may be arranged. They fluctuate to no purpose from thought to thought, and remain still uncertain and undetermined where to place it, or what to think of it. It is this fluctuation and vain recollection, together with the emotion or movement of the spirits that they excite, which constitute the sentiment properly called wonder, and which occasion that staring, and sometimes that rolling of the eyes, that suspension of the breath, and that swelling of the heart, which we may all observe, both in ourselves and others, when wondering at some new object, and which are the natural symptoms of uncertain and undetermined thought. The notion of spirits associated with material bodies has a long and highly complex history. Smiths miss here to be assuming some kind of paramaterial stuff, such as Descartes had supposed to flow in the hollow nerves, and to interact with the extensionless soul in the unpaired pineal gland in the brain. These spirits always excite the idea. What sort of thing can that be? What is that like? What is that like? Are the questions which, upon such an occasion, we are all naturally disposed to ask. If we cannot recollect many such objects which exactly resemble this new appearance, and which present themselves to the imagination naturally, and as it were of their own accord, our wonder is entirely at an end. If we can recollect but a few, and which it requires too some trouble to be able to call up, our wonder is indeed diminished, but not quite destroyed. If we can recollect none, but are quite at a loss, it is the greatest possible. With what curious attention does a naturalist examine a singular plant or a singular fossil that is presented to him! He is at no loss to refer it to the general genus of plants or fossile, fossils. But this does not satisfy him, and when he considers all the different tribes or species of either with which he has hitherto been acquainted, they all, he thinks, refuse to admit the new object among them. It stands alone in his imagination, and as it were detached from all the other species of that genus to which it belongs. He labors, however, to connect it with some one or other of them. Sometimes he thinks it may be placed in this, and sometimes in that other assortment. Nor is he ever satisfied till he has fallen upon one which, in most of its qualities, it resembles. When he cannot do this, rather than it should stand quite by itself, he will enlarge the precincts, if I may say so, of some species, in order to make room for it. Or he will create a new species no purpose to receive it, and call it a play of nature, or give it some other appellation, under which he arranges all the oddities that he knows not what else to do with. But to some class or other of known objects he must refer it, and betwixt it and them he must find out some resemblance or other, before he can get rid of that wonder, that uncertainty and anxious curiosity excited by its singular appearance, and by its dissimilitude with all the objects he had hitherto observed. As single and individual objects thus excite our wonder when, by their uncommon qualities and singular appearance, they make us uncertain to what species of things we ought to refer them. So a succession of objects which follow one another in an uncommon train or order will produce the same effect, though there be nothing particular in any one of them taken by itself. When one accustomed object appears after another, which it does not usually follow, it first excites, by its unexpectedness, the sentiment properly called surprise, and afterwards, by the singularity of the succession, or order of its appearance, the sentiment properly called wonder. We start and are surprised at feeling it there, and then wonder how it came there. The motion of a small piece of iron along a plain table is in itself no extraordinary object, yet the person who first saw it begin, without any visible impulse, in consequence of the motion of a lodestone at some little distance from it, could not behold it without the most extreme surprise; and when that momentary motion was over, he would still wonder how it came to be conjoined to an event with which, according to the ordinary train of things, he could have so little suspected it to have any connection. The phraseology of this paragraph follows more closely that of Hume. See note 1 to section 1 above. When two objects, however unlike, have often been observed to follow each other, and have constantly presented themselves to the senses in that order, they come to be so connected together in the fancy, that the idea of the one seems of its own accord to call up and introduce that of the other. If the objects are still observed to succeed each other as before, this connection, or as it has been called, this association of their ideas, becomes stricter and stricter, and the habit of the imagination to pass from the conception of the one to that of the other grows more and more riveted and confirmed. As its ideas move more rapidly than external objects, it is continually running before them, and therefore anticipates, before it happens, every event which falls out according to this ordinary course of things. When objects succeed each other in the same train in which the ideas of the imagination have thus been accustomed to move, and in which, though not conducted by that chain of events presented to the senses, they have acquired a tendency to go on of their own accord, such objects appear all closely connected with one another, and the thought glides easily along them, without effort and without interruption. A similar expression is used in ancient physics. The idea is derived from Hume, see especially treatise. And as the ideas which represented the objects themselves occur, every last event seems, in the same manner, to be introduced by the foregoing and to introduce the succeeding. There is no break, no stop, no gap, no interval. The ideas excited by so coherent a chain of things seem, as it were, to float through the mind of their own accord, without obliging it to exert itself or to make any effort in order to pass from one of them to another. But if this customary connection be interrupted, if one or more objects appear in an order quite different from that to which the imagination has been accustomed, and for which it is prepared, the contrary of all this happens. We are at first surprised by the unexpectedness of the new appearance. Smith's approach to the problem of scientific knowledge has an interesting, perhaps vital, bearing on inductivism, and its denial by Sir Karl Popper and his disciples. Whitehead, sometimes we see an elephant and sometimes we do not, process and reality. And when that momentary emotion is over, we still wonder how it came to occur in that place. The imagination no longer feels the usual facility of passing from the event which goes before to that which comes after. It is an order or law of succession to which it has not been accustomed, and which it therefore finds some difficulty in following or in attending to. The fancy is stopped and interrupted in that natural movement or career according to which it was proceeding. Those two events seem to stand at a distance from each other. It endeavors to bring them together, but they refuse to unite, and it feels, or imagines it feels, something like a gap or interval betwixt them. It naturally hesitates, and, as it were, pauses upon the brink of this interval. It endeavors to find out something which may fill up the gap. Smith is again adapting the thought of Hume in treatise. A similar idea that a gap in a narration can be a source of discomfort is mentioned in LRBL, which, like a bridge, may so far at least unite those seemingly distant objects as to render the passage of the thought betwixt them smooth and natural and easy. The supposition of a chain of intermediate, though invisible, events which succeed each other in a train similar to that in which the imagination has been accustomed to move, and which link together those two disjointed appearances, is the only means by which the imagination can fill up this interval, is the only bridge which, if one may say so, can smooth its passage from the one object to the other. Thus, when you observe the motion of the iron, in consequence of that of the lodestone, we gaze and hesitate, and feel a want of connection betwixt two events which follow one another in so unusual a train. But when, with Descartes, we imagine sudden invisible effluvia, Descartes' natural philosophy was based on the denial of empty space in the cosmos. Action at a distance was similarly ruled out, hence the necessity of postulating a medium. The term effluvium had already been used by W. Gilbert for the supposed exhalation uniting electrics, such as amber, to other bodies. He did not apply this concept to magnetic attraction. To circulate round one of them, and by their repeated impulses to impel the other, both to move towards it, and to follow its motion, we fill up the interval betwixt them, we join them together by a sort of bridge, and thus take off that hesitation and difficulty which the imagination felt in passing from the one to the other. That the iron should move after the lodestone seems, upon this hypothesis, in some measure according to the ordinary course of things. Motion after impulse is an order of succession with which of all things we are the most familiar. Two objects which are so connected seem no longer to be disjoined, and the imagination flows smoothly and easily along them. To explain a change is to discover a means of showing that no real change has taken place. What E. Meyerson called l'identification de l'antécédent et du conséquent dans Identité et réalité. Such is the nature of this second species of wonder, which arises from an unusual succession of things. The stop which is thereby given to the career of the imagination, the difficulty which it finds in passing along such disjointed objects, and the feeling of something like a gap or interval betwixt them, constitute the whole essence of this emotion. Upon the clear discovery of a connecting chain of intermediate events, it vanishes altogether. What obstructed the movement of the imagination is then removed. Who wonders at the machinery of the opera house who has once been admitted behind the scenes? In the wonders of nature, however, it rarely happens that we can discover so clearly this connecting chain. With regard to a few even of them, indeed, we seem to have been already admitted behind the scenes, and our wonder accordingly is entirely at an end. Thus the eclipses of the sun and moon, which once, more than all the other appearances in the heavens, excited the terror and amazement of mankind, seem now no longer to be wonderful, since the connecting chain has been found out which joins them to the ordinary course of things. Nay, in those cases in which we have been less successful, even the vague hypotheses of Descartes and the yet more indeterminate notions of Aristotle have, in their followers, contributed to give some coherence to the appearances of nature, and might diminish, though they could not destroy, their wonder. If they did not completely fill up the interval betwixt the two disjointed objects, they bestowed upon them, however, some sort of loose connection which they wanted before. That the imagination feels a real difficulty in passing along two events which follow one another in an uncommon order may be confirmed by many obvious observations. If it attempts to attend beyond a certain time to a long series of this kind, the continual efforts it is obliged to make, in order to pass from one object to another and thus follow the progress of the succession, soon fatigue it, and if repeated too often, disorder and disjoint its whole frame. It is thus that too severe an application to study sometimes brings on lunacy and frenzy, in those especially who are somewhat advanced in life, but whose imaginations, from being too late in applying, have not got those habits which dispose them to follow easily the reasonings in the abstract sciences. Every step of a demonstration, which to an old practitioner is quite natural and easy, requires from them the most intense application of thought. Spurred on, however, either by ambition or by admiration for the subject, they still continue till they become first confused, then giddy, and at last distracted. Could we conceive a person of the soundest judgment, who had grown up to maturity, and whose imagination had acquired those habits, and that mould which the constitution of things in this world necessarily impress upon it, to be all at once transported alive to some other planet, where nature was governed by laws quite different from those which take place here, as we would be as he would be continually obliged to attend to events which must to him appear in the highest degree jarring, irregular, and discordant, he would soon feel the same confusion and giddiness begin to come upon him, which would at last end in the same manner in lunacy and distraction. Neither, to produce this effect, is it necessary that the objects should be either great or interesting, or even uncommon in themselves. It is sufficient that they follow one another in an uncommon order. Let anyone attempt to look over even a game of cards, and to attend particularly to every single stroke, and if he is unacquainted with the nature and rules of the game, that is, with the laws which regulate the succession of the cards, he will soon feel the same confusion and giddiness begin to come upon him, which, were it to be continued for days and months, would end in the same manner in lunacy and distraction. But if the mind be thus thrown into the most violent disorder, when it attends to a long series of events which follow one another in an uncommon train, it must feel some degree of the same disorder when it observes even a single event fall out in this unusual manner. For the violent disorder can arise from nothing but the too frequent repetition of this smaller uneasiness. That it is the unusualness alone of the succession which occasions this stop and interruption in the progress of the imagination, as well as the notion of an interval betwixt the two immediately succeeding objects, to be filled up by some chain of intermediate events, is not less evident. The same orders of succession, which to one set of men seem quite according to the natural course of things, and such as require no intermediate events to join them, shall to another appear altogether incoherent and disjointed, unless some such events be supposed, and this for no other reason, but because such orders of succession are familiar to the one and strange to the other. When we enter the workhouses of the most common artisans, such as dyers, brewers, distillers, We observe a number of appearances which present themselves in an order that seems to us very strange and wonderful. Our thought cannot easily follow it. We feel an interval betwixt every two of them, and require some chain of intermediate events to fill it up and link them together. But the artisan himself, who has been for many years familiar with the consequences of all the operations of his art, feels no such interval. They fall in it with what custom has made the natural movement of his imagination. They no longer excite his wonder, and if he is not a genius superior to his profession, so as to be capable of making the very easy reflection that those things, though familiar to him, may be strange to us, he will be disposed rather to laugh at than sympathize with our wonder. He unites those appearances which seem to him to succeed each other very naturally. It is their nature, he tells us, to follow one another in this order, and that accordingly they always do so. In imitative arts, after a little use and experience, all looking glasses cease to be wonders altogether, and even the ignorant become so familiar with them as not to think that their effects require any explication. In the same manner, bread has, since the world began, been the common nourishment of the human body, and men have so long seen it, every day, converted into flesh and bones, substances in all respects so unlike it, that they have seldom had the curiosity to inquire by what process of intermediate events this change is brought about. Because the passage of the thought from the one object to the other is by custom become quite smooth and easy, almost without the supposition of any such process. Philosophers, indeed, who often look for a chain of invisible objects to join together two events that occur in an order familiar to all the world, have endeavored to find out a chain of this kind betwixt the two events I have just now mentioned, in the same manner as they have endeavored, by a like intermediate chain, to connect the gravity, the elasticity, and even the cohesion of natural bodies with some of their other qualities. These, however, are all of them such combinations of events as give no stop to the imaginations of the bulk of mankind, as excite no wonder, nor any apprehension that there is wanting the strictest connection between them. But as in those sounds, which to the greater part of men seem perfectly agreeable to measure in harmony, the nicer ear of a musician will discover a want both of the most exact time and of the most perfect coincidence, so the more practised thought of a philosopher, who has spent his whole life in the study of the connecting principles of nature, will often feel an interval betwixt two objects which, to more careless observers, seem very strictly conjoined. By long attention to all the connections which have ever been presented to his observation, by having often compared them with one another, he has, like the musician, acquired, if one may say so, a nicer ear and a more delicate feeling with regard to things of this nature. And as to the one, that music seems dissonance which falls short of the most perfect harmony, so to the other, those events seem altogether separated and disjoined, which fall short of the strictest and most perfect connection. Philosophy is the science of the connecting principles of nature. A similar definition of moral philosophy in particular is given in For a discussion of Smith's indiscriminate use of philosophy, see the editor's introduction. Nature, after the largest experience that common observation can acquire, seems to abound with events which appear solitary and incoherent with all that go before them, which therefore disturb the easy movement of the imagination, which make its ideas succeed. Where is it? Each other, if one may say so, by irregular starts and sallies, and which thus tend, in some measure, to introduce those confusions and distractions we formerly mentioned. Philosophy, by representing the invisible chains which bind together all these disjointed objects, endeavors to introduce order into this chaos of jarring and discordant appearances, to allay this tumult of the imagination, and to restore it, when it surveys the great revolutions of the universe, to that tone of tranquillity and composure which is both most agreeable in itself and most suitable to its nature. Philosophy, therefore, may be regarded as one of those arts which address themselves to the imagination, and whose theory and history, upon that account, fall properly within the circumference of our subject. Let us endeavour to trace it, from its first origin, up to that summit of perfection to which it is at present supposed to have arrived, and to which, indeed, it has equally been supposed to have arrived in almost all former times. It is the most sublime of all the agreeable arts, and its revolutions have been the greatest, the most frequent, and the most distinguished of all those that have happened in the literary world. Its history, therefore, must, upon all accounts, be the most entertaining and the most instructive. Let us examine, therefore, all the different systems of nature, which, in these western parts of the world, the only parts of whose history we know anything, an exaggeration, Western natural philosophy owed a great deal to Eastern thinkers who wrote in Arabic, a fact well known at that time, have successively been adopted by the learned and ingenious, and, without regarding their absurdity or probability, their agreement or inconsistency with truth and reality, let us consider them only in that particular point of view which belongs to our subject, and content ourselves with inquiring how far each of them was fitted to soothe the imagination, and to render the theatre of nature a more coherent, and therefore a more magnificent spectacle, than otherwise it would have appeared to be. According as they have failed or succeeded in this, they have constantly failed or succeeded in gaining reputation and renown to their authors. And this will be found to be the clue that is most capable of conducting us through all the labyrinths of philosophical history, for in the meantime it will serve to confirm what has gone before, and to throw light upon what is of philosophical history. For in the meantime it will serve to confirm what has gone before, and to throw light upon what is to come after, and that we observe, in general, that no system, how well soever in other respects supported, has ever been able to gain any general credit on the world, whose connecting principles were not such as were familiar to all mankind. Why has the chemical philosophy in all ages crept along in obscurity? Smith could hardly have written this in Glasgow, where William Cullen in 1748 began his epoch-making popularization of chemistry in relation to industry and agriculture as well as medicine. It appears to be further evidence for the relatively early composition of this essay, and been so disregarded by the generality of mankind, while other systems, less useful and not more agreeable to experience, have possessed universal admiration for whole centuries together. The connecting principles of the chemical philosophy are such as the generality of mankind know nothing about, have rarely seen, and have never been acquainted with, and which to them, therefore, are incapable of smoothing the passage of the imagination betwixt any two seemingly disjointed objects. Salts, sulphurs, and mercuries, acids, and alkalis are principles which can smooth things to those only who live about the furnace, but whose most common operations seem, to the bulk of mankind, as disjointed as any two events which the chemists could connect together by them. Modern chemical nomenclature became possible only after Lavoisier's Traité élémentaire de chimie. The plural sulfurs and mercuries reveal the persistence of alchemical and Paracelsian modes of thought, the former being the principle of combustibility, the latter that of metallicity. Smith should have been aware that acids and alkalis had never been regarded as principles. At that time they were regarded as varieties of salts. Nevertheless, his exemplification of Francis Bacon's idols shows an important general insight. Those artists, however, naturally explained things to themselves by principles that were familiar to themselves. As Aristotle observes, that the early Pythagoreans, who first studied arithmetic, explained all things by the properties of numbers, and Cicero tells us that Aristoxenus, the musician, found the nature of the sword to consist in harmony. In the same manner, a learned physician lately gave a system of moral philosophy upon the principles of his own art. De la Métrie, Discours sur le bonheur, with different titles for substantially the same work. This comes closer to Smith's description than does Observations on Man by David Hartley, likewise a physician turned philosopher. La Maîtrise book, which arose from his translation of Seneca, De Beata Vita, is both critical and appreciative of Stoic ethics, and may well have attracted Smith's attention for that reason. In which wisdom and virtue were the healthful state of the soul, the different vices and follies, the different diseases to which it was subject, in which the causes and symptoms of those diseases were ascertained, and in the same medical strain, a proper method of cure prescribed. In the same manner also, others have written parallels of painting and poetry, of poetry and music, of music and architecture, of beauty and virtue, of all the fine arts, systems which have universally owed their origin to the lucubrations of those who were acquainted with the one art, but ignorant of the other, who therefore explained to themselves the phenomena in that which was strange to them, by those in that which was familiar, and with whom, upon that account, the analogy, which in other writers gives occasion to a few ingenious similitudes, became the great hinge upon which everything turned. So below Smith writes of Kepler's excessive tendency to explain by analogy. Section 3 of The Origin of Philosophy. Page 48. Pour la suite.